Okay, so GABA is the thin section of this chapter, but it's not unimportant in any way. We did glutamate, dominant role in fast excitatory transmission in the CNS, and GABA and glycine, where we will primarily focus on GABA. GABA is the number one inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. And how many times have I been saying yin and yang? Let's quickly skip to the figure on the right. Look at what's at the top of that figure. Yeah, glutamate, yin and yang. How do you make GABA? You make it out of glutamate using GAD, glutamic acid decarboxylase. Whoa, dude, does this have something to do with our evolutionary history? I suspect. And yeah, we invent a potent excitatory amino acid neurotransmitter, and then we turn around and we take that and we turn it into a potent amino acid inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. So there's how it's made, and there are drugs that mess with that. And there are other inhibitory neurotransmitters, and now they're going to, say, well, for this reason, because it also this is about synaptic vesicle storage, because we also use this transporter for glycine. This transporter is sometimes referred to as VIAAT, vesicular inhibitory amino acid transporter, instead of VGAT, vesicular GABA transporter. I can't get into it. But yeah, there's a transporter, just like everything else. We're going to safely store our neurotransmitter where the maintenance people can't get it, in vesicles. And look, there are different transporters: GAT1, GAT2, and GAT3. 1 and 2 neurons and astrocytes. GAT3 astrocytes only. So astrocytes rear their head again. Now, should we be surprised by this? If astrocytes are important for glutamate, why not GABA? And then there are drugs. And here's a nice figure that shows ionotropic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And we've seen a lot of this stuff. Let's follow the reuptake, because that's amusing. So you're releasing GABA, and of course you have GABA transporter to put the thing in the vesicle, and you've got postsynaptic receptors. Notice that there's no transporter on the postsynaptic membrane, but there's a transporter, and it could be one of three, GAT1, 2, and 3 on the astrocyte. And what do you do with the GABA? You turn it into glutamate, which we know is dangerous. So what do you do with the glutamate? You turn it into glutamine. And what do you do with that? Now you've got glutamine transporters that schlep the glutamine out of the astrocytes, and transporters that schlep it into the presynaptic cell, where the glutamine can be turned into glutamate, and round it goes. Also, notice GAT1 can transport the GABA directly into the presynaptic cell. GABA is not as scary as glutamate in terms. It doesn't cause cell death or anything. So there's discussion of drugs, and you should take a look at those. And here we go. So possible segregated versus combined synaptic vesicle loading of glutamate and GABA. So on the top, you have the glutamate and GABA ending up in different vesicles. And on the right, you have the glutamate and GABA sometimes in different vesicles and sometimes in the same vesicles. It's important, not life and death for this course, but it's something that's important to drug development and potentially someday to drug release. Now, isn't it interesting? GABA glutamate co-release, yin and yang, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters partnering up to control normal activity in the nervous system. Where is GABA? Lots of places. It's been estimated as many as 10 to 40% of nerve terminals in the cerebral cortex. Ooh, that's an important place. Hippocampus, that's important. Substantia nigra use GABA. That means GABA is going to be important to a lot of things that we care about. Other areas that are rich in GABA, the cerebellum, the striatum, the globus pallidus, the olfactory bulbs, which probably aren't very important to us, but rats care about them quite a bit, to the extent that rats care. In some structures, such as the cerebral cortex, GABA is found in interneurons. And interneurons are little neurons that go between things, and they modulate the yin and the yang, inhibitory, and there are also long-distance ones. Look, from the striatum to the globus pallidus, which we're not so interested in, but if it goes to the substantia nigra, suddenly we are, because the substantia nigra is sending dopamine to the striatum. And now we find the striatum is sending GABA back to the substantia nigra. Hello, yin and yang. So the target can become the modulator. And there's a discussion of GABA in Parkinson's disease. And another one of my favorites. GABA is the neurotransmitter used by Purkinje cells. Now, remember, Purkinjes are not pyramidals because they don't look like pyramids. Purkinje cells look like fan corals. They look like your fingers. They're branched in one direction but held another way. You can just see one finger at a time. And they, in the cerebellar cortex, send neurons to the deep cerebellar nuclei and the brainstem. And we used to always say that the cerebellum was important for motor, and it certainly is. And if you've got Holmes cerebellar degeneration, you have trouble. But this cerebellum does much more than simply motor. Actions of GABA are primarily on GABA A. Like glutamate, GABA uses both ionotropic and metabotropic. But mercifully, there's only one type of each, GABA A, ionotropic, and GABA B, metabotropic. And we're going to focus on GABA A because that's what most of the drugs that we deal with deals with. And chloride comes back. And we've been talking about potassium a lot. For inhibition, chloride is important. But chloride is pretty happy at the resting potential. So it sort of fights to keep you there. And if you are kept at your resting potential, you can't get to your threshold of activation. And if you're near the threshold of activation and chloride channels open, it will flow into the cell and make the cell more negative and move you away from that threshold. So it's a little odd, but it's very important. And GABA is the number one inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and chloride is important. So chloride is important. Look, it's an ion channel. Therefore, there are five. There are subunits. In this case, there are five. There are four different kinds. You may have noticed I don't tend to worry about kinds very much. Epilepsy. Okay, so there's a big discussion of epilepsy. Epilepsy is very important. It's very disruptive. That Disney actor may have just died because of uncontrolled epileptic seizure. Notice NMDA receptors come up here again, which is glutamate, but also certainly GABA. I used to do a lot of seizure activity. Interictal is between seizures. Um, but even between seizures, the brain is odd if it has developed epileptic phenomena in it. And these are brain slices from patients with epilepsy. What are you talking about? These are humans. How do you do this? Well, sometimes for human surgery, I'm going to go look up one of my favorite humans who did this surgery, Roger Penfield surgery. And we'll look at some of his pictures. And there he is. He's a great dude. He really knew neuroanatomy, and despite my negative statements about soccer and football, he played uh, football, I think, at Princeton. This is a picture of one of his surgeries. Imagine that in color. Black and white works fine for what he wanted. That's an exposed human brain in a living human being, and the person is conscious, and they're talking to the person, and you see those numbers on the cerebral cortex. That's not Photoshop. Those are sterile pieces of paper with numbers on them, and he's putting them on the cortex to remind him and record where he stimulated the cortex, because he stimulates the cortex often to try to produce the aura that precedes a seizure, because he's in there trying to cut out epilepsy, almost quite literally. And he wants to know where the epileptic focus is. And if he's in any part of the brain where language might be happening, he wants to know if he's about to mess with a piece of cortex that's important for language. So he's chatting up the patient. Now, the brain itself has no pain receptors. Certainly the skull does and the skin does, so all that is anesthetized. You saw the picture of the stereotaxic frame. The person is being held in something like that. But that's Wilder Penfield, and he did quite the research. So if you're in there and you're going to destroy a part of the brain, you might, you know, you could freeze it, but you could also suck it, or you could cut it out. And once you cut it out, you can do with it what you do with the hippocampus from the rat, and you can do recordings from it, and you can look at the effects of drugs on real human tissue from a brain that's really epileptic. It's mind-boggling, and that's that discussion. And there's your GABA A. Now it's complicated, not crazy complicated like NMDA, but it's complicated. Notice that there's a GABA site. There's a neurosteroid site, which we haven't mentioned before, and we won't talk about very much. There's a barbiturate site, and there's a picrotoxins. I've used that on animals, but you probably have never heard of that before. So it's complicated, and things can dock at locations on the receptor complex that are not the GABA receptor, and thereby affect the complex. And there's chloride that wants to get through there. Five subunits: benzodiazepines, barbiturates, neurosteroids, picrotoxin. Note the locations are arbitrary and not meant to be anatomically accurate. And there's a cute little mushroom, cute as a button. That's where muscimol comes from, as in muscarinic. Uh, it also is important for GABA. Um, Oh, I'm sorry, muscimol. It comes from it's muscarine. Muscimol is the agonist for GABA A. Muscarine is the agonist for muscarinic receptors. This is a cute story. In earlier times, you'd chop it up and you'd put it in milk and wait, and flies would come along and drink the milk, which is now infused with muscimol and muscarine, and it makes the flies stupid and they're easy to catch. Apparently, it also has recreational effects. Now, here they're talking about drinking the urine of someone who has eaten this, um, a human. I remember them giving it to donkeys or something and drinking the urine of donkeys. I don't know if that's any more appealing. But look at this, what it can do. When administered to humans at relatively high doses, pure muscimol causes intoxication characterized by hyperthermia, pupil dilation, elevation of mood, difficulties in concentration, anorexia, you don't feel like eating, ataxia, catalepsy, and hallucinations. Many of these effects are similar to those associated with more traditional hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD. That's intriguing. Uh, I I think I'd be more prone to taking LSD than donkey urine. Bicuculline is a competitive antagonist for the GABA receptor. I've used that in research. Um, Pentyletrazole, obviously a word I don't say often, was once used to produce convulsions in people suffering from depression. That may surprise you, but you may have heard of electroconvulsive shock therapy. Um, Sometimes there's a lifting of depressive symptoms after a generalized seizure. We used to use chemicals for this. Now it's more common to use electroconvulsive shock. Um, if you want to lift depressive symptoms quickly, it works pretty well and pretty fast. Now with the introduction of ketamine, we may be doing yes of this. Oh, there we go. Reindeer, wasn't donkeys. Uh, Reindeer urine, not donkey urine. Allosteric modulators. Allosteric modulators come up again. Benzodiazepines, barbiturates, ethanol. Ethanol at high doses does a lot of stuff that's not very specific, but at moderate doses, it pretty much focuses on GABA A. So these drugs are not affecting where GABA docks. They are affecting the receptor complex, which means you are modulating the effects of your own GABA. Now, when you use an anesthetic like a barbiturate, like pentobarbital, which I've used a lot for animal surgery, there they can affect the channel directly. No GABA need apply. But most of these other things work in conjunction with GABA. And of course, if they're agonistic, they're increasing the effectiveness. Um, and Valium is, I know people taking Valium. It's a benzodiazepine. Um, Potency of GABA to activate the receptor is increased. More inhibition, chloride is discussed there again. Um, Dose response curves, there's a figure on the next page that shows how benzodiazepine shifts the response to GABA. Earlier, we had dose response curves where antagonists were shifting the dose response curve to the right. Here, benzodiazepines are going to shift the dose response curve to the left. Um, Extrasynaptic receptors, I don't think about them very much. but they are an important target for ethanol and anesthetics and neurosteroids. Uh, Significant contributor to the sedating, sleep promoting, and other behavioral effects of non-benzodiazepine positive allosteric modulators. Um, we don't talk about that very much, and I haven't thought about those very much, but there you go. And this figure I just love, mostly for the figure on the right. So positive allosteric activation of the GABA A receptor by diazepam, which is a benzodiazepine. So there's membrane potential, that purple line, and you're giving little bursts of GABA, and the cell hyperpolarizes, and then it goes back to normal. And you give some GABA, and it hyperpolarizes and go back to normal. And then you give some diazepam, and the cell doesn't notice because there's no GABA. And then, oh my, now you have GABA and diazepam being administered, and boom, to the moon. You get a huge synergistic effect. Uh, yeah, and do not mix barbiturates and alcohol, or you can end up dead like Marilyn Monroe. And there's a shift to the left. So red is GABA only, and blue is GABA with the allosteric agonistic effect of diazepam. Um, Olfactory bulbs, again, not very important for humans. Neurosteroids, uh, they are important. I don't talk about them very much. I'm glad the book does. And I think we're almost out of here. Benzodiazepines, GABA A, GABA B. As mentioned earlier, the metabitopic receptor GABA B. They're both postsynaptic and pre. And hello, potassium. And we know that when they are inhibited in neurofiring by opening potassium channels. And at rest, there's more potassium in there than we would like. I've said now like 5 times, 8 times. And you open those channels and potassium leaves and the cell becomes more negative. And they also can inhibit calcium from entering the cell. And boy, that's going to have an effect. So GABA B involved in a wide variety of behavioral functions, learning and memory, anxiety, depression, drugs of abuse, which probably means VTA, and nucleus accumbens. And that's the end of this. Let's hope I have audio. Have a nice day, and then the chapters will change.